She didn't pull over because she was a good person. She stopped because the broken-down luxury sedan on the black, sleet-slicked highway looked like an expensive mistake, and she wanted a front-row seat. Then she saw the face of the man shivering in the freezing rain. The man who had ruined her life 12 hours earlier. The carpet in the executive corridor didn't make a sound. That was the first thing Sarah hated about it. It was a thick, charcoal gray sponge that swallowed the sharp click of her cheap heels, stripping her of whatever urgency she was trying to project. It was 9:14 a.m. Her right shin throbbed from where she'd slammed it into the edge of Leo's crib an hour ago, scrambling to find his asthma inhaler while the backup babysitter, a neighbor who smelled faintly of stale beer and disinterest, stood in the doorway, complaining about the early hour. Sarah's blouse, a polyester blend that trapped sweat against her ribs, clung uncomfortably to her underarms. She smelled like sour coffee, panic, and the damp wool of her winter coat. She stopped outside the glass-walled corner office. Her reflection in the glass was awful. Mascara flaked under her left eye. A smear of generic brand peanut butter stained her cuff. She looked exactly like what she was. A 31-year-old data analyst drowning in the undertow of single motherhood. Inside, Arthur stood by the window, dictating something into his phone. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He just raised one finger, a perfectly manicured index finger, signaling her to wait. Sarah stood there. The HVAC system hummed, pushing aggressively sterile, dry air into her face. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She swallowed, tasting copper and old toothpaste. Arthur ended his call. He slipped the phone into the breast pocket of a navy suit that cost more than Sarah's car. He turned. He was a man in his late 50s who looked like he had been vacuum sealed at 45. His hair was a precise silver brushstroke. His skin looked expensive, tight, moisturized, scrubbed of anything resembling a human struggle. 14 minutes, Sarah, he said. His voice was a flat baritone. No anger. Anger required an emotional investment he wasn't willing to make. I know, Sarah said. Her voice cracked. She hated herself instantly for the crack. Mr. Cade, I'm so sorry. The sitter canceled at 6 a.m. Leo couldn't find his inhaler, and the crosstown bus— I don't need the itinerary, Arthur interrupted, sitting at a desk that held nothing but a laptop and a single heavy tungsten pen. This is the third time this month. Second, she corrected, desperation making her stupid. The first time was a train delay. The city issued a notice. It's the third time you have failed to be at your desk at 8:30. He picked up the pen, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. It was a rhythmic, metallic sound. Click, slide, click, slide. This isn't a charity, Sarah. It's a logistics firm. If my data analysts cannot manage the logistics of their own mornings, I cannot trust them with the supply chains of our clients. I am caught up on all my accounts, she pleaded. The dignity she had promised herself she would keep was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, ugly terror. Rent was due in 6 days. She had $42 in her checking account. I worked until 11 last night from home. You have the spreadsheets. I do. Arthur opened his laptop. The blue light washed over his face, turning him into something carved from ice. Your work is adequate, but your presence is erratic. It sets a poor standard for the floor. Please. The word fell out of her mouth like a stone. She felt her face burn. A hot, prickly flush crawled up her neck. I need this job. It won't happen again. I'll sleep in the car. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, Arthur." He didn't blink. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the bridge of her nose, a management tactic she recognized from a seminar he had forced the staff to attend. "Human Resources has your severance packet," he said softly. 2 weeks' pay. Security will bring a box to your desk. Have a good life, Sarah." He looked back at his screen. The dismissal was so complete, so physically dismissive, it felt like a slap. Sarah stood there for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. She wanted to scream. She wanted to pick up the heavy tungsten pen and drive it through the top of his expensive laptop. Her hands shook, but the sheer gravity of her situation crushed the rebellion out of her. She turned and walked out. The thick carpet swallowed her footsteps again. She didn't exist. She was already a ghost in a polyester shirt. The cardboard box they gave her smelled like dust and dried glue. It wasn't even a full box. 7 framed photos of Leo, a cheap plastic succulent, a mug with a chip in the rim, and a spare pair of flats. That was the sum total of 3 years of her life. The security guard, a kid named Dave who usually joked with her about the terrible cafeteria coffee, didn't make eye contact as he walked her to the elevator. He just stared at the floor indicator, his jaw tight. It wasn't malicious. It was the awkwardness of being near a fresh corpse. He didn't want the bad luck to rub off on him. When she hit the street, the sleet had turned into a freezing horizontal rain. The sky was the color of a bruised knee, a sickly, yellowish gray. Sarah walked 3 blocks to the parking garage. By the time she reached her 2009 Honda Civic, the cardboard box was soggy, the bottom threatening to give out. She dumped her life onto the passenger seat. The car smelled like stale goldfish crackers and old pennies. She sat in the driver's seat, gripped the steering wheel, and waited for the tears. They didn't come. Instead, her brain began a frantic, terrifying calculus. Rent, $1,400. Daycare, $800. Groceries, $300. Gas, $100. 2 weeks' severance was about $1,600 after taxes. She was $1,000 short for the month, and it was only the 4th of November. She leaned her forehead against the freezing steering wheel. The plastic was rough, peeling at the edges. "Okay," she whispered to the empty car. "Okay. She couldn't go home. If she went home, she would have to look at her kid, look at his trusting, stupidly innocent face. And she knew she would shatter. She needed momentum. She needed cash. She pulled out her phone, opening the gig work app she hadn't touched since she got promoted to full-time 2 years ago. Status, active. She turned the key. The engine cranked, wheezed, and caught. The heater blasted air that smelled faintly of melting plastic and damp dog. Though she didn't own a dog. For the next 10 hours, Sarah drove. She drove through the worsening storm, delivering soggy bags of lukewarm fast food to college dorms and suburban porches. Her back seized into a tight, hard knot of pain between her shoulder blades. Her wet feet went completely numb. The windshield wipers on the Civic squealed a high-pitched, agonizing protest with every swipe, barely smearing the freezing rain away. She ignored the notifications on her phone. Missed calls from her mom. A text from the babysitter asking when she was coming back. Soon, she texted at a red light. Working late. Overtime. A lie that tasted like ash. By 11:30 p.m., she was exhausted to the point of hallucination. the taillights of the cars ahead of her smeared into long red ribbons in the sleet. The city limits had faded behind her. She was on the outer loop now, a desolate stretch of highway flanked by dense, skeletal winter trees. It was pitch black, save for the weak yellow throw of her headlights. The app on her dashboard showed she had made $84.20. $84 for 10 hours of her life. A dark, heavy cynicism settled over her. It felt almost comforting, like a weighted blanket. This was it. The world wasn't a meritocracy. Hard work didn't mean anything. You either had the money to insulate yourself from the cold, or you were out in the storm, begging for crumbs. Men like Arthur Cade lived in a separate reality, a world of climate-controlled rooms and soundproof carpets. Men like him never felt the terror of an empty gas tank. She hated him. The intensity of it frightened her a little. She imagined him at a restaurant, eating a steak that cost more than her daily earnings. His silver hair catching the ambient lighting. Thump. Sarah jerked the wheel, her heart spiking into her throat. She had drifted onto the rumble strip. She forced her eyes wide open, digging her nails into the palms of her hands to stay awake. She needed to go home. $84 was going to have to be enough for today. She took the next exit, merging onto Route 114, a winding, unlit secondary road that cut through the state park. It was a shortcut back to her neighborhood, but she hated driving it at night. It was isolated, prone to flooding, and completely dead at this hour. The sleet drummed a frantic rhythm against the roof. 2 miles down the road, she saw the lights. They were flashing, weak and rhythmic, piercing through the gray sheets of rain. Hazard lights. As she drew closer, the shape of a car materialized on the narrow shoulder. It was sitting at an awkward angle, its front right tire sunk deep into the muddy trench beside the asphalt. Sarah's foot hovered over the brake. Her instinct, the cynical, exhausted voice in her head, screamed at her to keep going. You are a woman alone on a dark road in a storm. You have a kid waiting for you. You are exhausted. Keep driving. She slowed to 30 miles per hour, squinting through the rain-streaked glass. It was a Mercedes S-Class, sleek, black, and completely out of place on this crumbling stretch of back road. The passenger side was pressed against a steep, muddy embankment. The driver's side door was open. A figure stood in the rain, illuminated by the red flash of the hazard lights. Sarah tapped the brakes, her tires hissing on the wet road. She didn't want to stop. She really didn't. But the figure was waving a phone flashlight wildly. She crawled closer, rolling down her passenger window 3 inches. The freezing wind slapped her in the face, smelling of wet asphalt, pine needles, and ozone. The flashlight beam hit her eyes, blinding her for a second. "Hey, please!" a man's voice yelled over the roar of the wind. "My tire blew out. There's no cell service out here. I just need a ride to the nearest station." Sarah's heart stopped. She knew that voice. It was stripped of its flat, baritone arrogance. It was ragged, panicked, and shivering. But she knew it. The rhythm of it. The way he clipped his consonants. She threw the Civic into park and leaned over the center console, staring out the cracked window. The man lowered the flashlight. He was soaked to the bone. The expensive navy suit was plastered to his frame, black with rain and streaked with yellow mud. His silver hair was plastered flat against his skull, making him look older, frailer. His face was pale, his lips carrying a faint bluish tint in the cold red light. It was Arthur. For a long, suspended moment, the universe shrank to the interior of Sarah's freezing car. Arthur peered into the dark gap of the window, rain dripping off his nose. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. She was just a shadow behind a steering wheel, a generic savior in a beat-up sedan. "Please," he said, stepping closer. His teeth were audibly chattering. "I'll pay you whatever you want." I slid on a patch of black ice. The tire is gone. The suspension is cracked. My phone can't get a signal. Sarah didn't speak. Her lungs felt locked. A hot, feral spike of joy pierced through her exhaustion. It was an ugly feeling. It tasted like blood in the mouth, metallic, sharp, and deeply satisfying. Look at him, the man who had dismissed her entire existence with a flick of his tungsten pen, the man who had condemned her to a night of begging for tips in a freezing storm. Here he was, stripped of his glass walls and his thick carpets, reduced to a shivering, pathetic animal on the side of a dark road. She could just roll up the window. The thought was intoxicating. She could roll up the window, put the car in drive, and leave him here. Let him walk the 5 miles to the highway in the sleet. Let his expensive leather shoes disintegrate in the mud. Let him feel, just for one night, what it was like to be entirely, hopelessly vulnerable. Her hand hovered over the window switch. "I have cash," Arthur said, his voice cracking with a desperation she had never heard him use. He reached into his ruined jacket, pulling out a sodden leather wallet. "Look, $500. Just let me in. It's freezing out here." He was holding up a wad of wet green paper. Sarah stared at the money. $500. That was daycare. That was groceries. That was a stay of execution. She looked from the money to his face. The polished veneer was completely gone. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and framed by deep, bruised bags. He looked terrified. "This isn't a charity, Sarah." His words from that morning echoed in her ears, pristine and cruel. She realized she was trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming power she suddenly held. She was the logistics firm now. She was the one holding the pen. She pressed her thumb against the window switch. The glass hummed, sliding up an inch. Arthur's hand shot out, grabbing the top edge of the window. "Wait! What are you doing? Please!" "Let go of my car," she said. Her voice was raspy, completely flat. She sounded like him. Arthur froze. He leaned down, squinting into the dark cabin. The red flash of the hazard lights pulsed, illuminating her face for a split second. His eyes widened. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He blinked, rainwater sliding into his eyes, shaking his head slightly as if trying to clear a hallucination. "Sarah?" he whispered. She didn't answer. "Oh, God," Arthur breathed, stepping back, his hand dropping from the glass. He looked at her, then at his wrecked Mercedes, then back at her. The absurdity of the situation seemed to crush the breath out of him. The shivering intensified. He didn't ask again. He stood there in the mud, clutching his wet wallet, looking at the woman he had fired 12 hours ago. He knew he had no leverage. He knew exactly what he deserved. Sarah watched him. She waited for the satisfaction to settle in, for that feral joy to warm her frozen bones. But it didn't. Instead, she just felt tired. Looking at Arthur, she didn't see a monster anymore. She saw an old man in a wet suit standing in the mud, rapidly approaching hypothermia. Letting him freeze wouldn't put the money back in her bank account. It wouldn't give her a new job. It would just make her the same kind of cold, indifferent machinery he was. She hated him, yes. But she hated the idea of becoming him even more. She slammed her hand against the lock button on the door panel. Clack! Get in, she snapped. Arthur didn't move for a second, stunned. Then, stumbling over the uneven pavement, he pulled open the passenger door and collapsed into the seat. He brought the storm in with him. The cabin instantly smelled of wet wool, mud, and panic. He pulled the door shut, trapping them in the small, dim space. The heater hissed, blowing tepid air onto his soaked knees. He didn't say thank you. He just sat there, hugging himself, shaking violently, staring straight ahead at the squeaking windshield wipers. Sarah reached over and roughly pushed the cardboard box of her belongings onto the floorboard in the back, making room for him. The irony of the movement wasn't lost on either of them. She put the car in drive, her foot heavy on the pedal. The Civic lurched forward, leaving the crippled Mercedes behind in the dark. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the terrible, high-pitched squeal of the wipers and the chattering of Arthur's teeth. "You're going to ruin my seats," Sarah said finally, keeping her eyes fixed on the taillights of a distant truck. It wasn't a joke. Her voice was sharp, loaded with resentment. Arthur swallowed audibly. He looked down at the puddle of muddy water forming beneath his expensive shoes, on her cheap floor mats. "I'll pay for the detailing," he said, his voice a frail, vibrating rasp. He paused, staring at the cracked plastic of her dashboard, at the empty coffee cups in the console, and finally at the gig work app glowing on her phone mount. He saw the earnings for the night. $84.20. He looked away, turning his face toward the dark, wet window. "Why did you stop?" he asked, so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the engine. Sarah gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She thought about Leo's inhaler. She thought about the $500 in his wet wallet. She thought about the thick gray carpet in his office. "Because unlike you," Sarah said, the bitterness coating every syllable like tar, "I know what it feels like to be stranded." The interior of the Civic was a pressurized cabin of resentment. The heat finally kicked in, blasting dry, dusty air directly onto Arthur's sodden knees. As the freezing rainwater began to evaporate from his clothes, the smell of damp wool intensified, mixing with the metallic scent of wet rust from the floorboards. The mud on his Italian leather shoes was already baking into a pale, chalky crust. Sarah drove with both hands locked onto the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The muscles in her forearms were drawn tight like cables. She stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. Every time the car hit a pothole, the suspension groaned, and Arthur flinched, bracing a hand against the roof as if expecting the cheap ceiling to cave in on him. He looked entirely stripped of his morning armor. The silver hair that had been perfectly shellacked was now drying into frizzy, chaotic tufts. The blue tint had left his lips, replaced by a pale, waxy exhaustion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wet wad of bills again. The bills stuck together, heavy and green. He peeled them apart with stiff, trembling fingers and set them on the center console, right over the emergency brake. "Take it," he said. His voice was no longer a baritone command. It was gravelly, thinned out by the cold. Sarah glanced at the money. $500. The bills looked absurd sitting there next to a cracked plastic cup holder containing a sticky penny and an old gum wrapper. "I am dropping you at the Exxon on exit 42, she said, ignoring the cash. "They have a 24-hour diner. It's well lit. You can call a tow truck from a landline." I said, "Take the money, Sarah." "I charge base rate plus mileage," she replied, her voice deadpan, mimicking the corporate jargon he so loved. "You're out of my delivery zone. The app won't process it." Arthur let out a short, frustrated exhale, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It was the same gesture he'd used 12 hours ago, right before he fired her. Seeing it now in the dim yellow glow of the dashboard lights made a hot spike of anger twist in her gut. "Don't do that," he muttered. "Do what?" "Play the martyr. It doesn't suit you." Sarah slammed her foot on the brake. The Civic skidded on the slushy asphalt, the anti-lock brakes vibrating violently beneath her foot. The tires chewed through the sleet, fishtailing a few inches before the car jerked to a complete, aggressive halt on the shoulder. Arthur's seatbelt locked, snapping him back against the worn upholstery. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic squeaking of the windshield wipers. Sarah turned her head slowly. Her eyes were bloodshot from staring at wet roads for 10 hours. Her hair was greasy. She knew she looked unhinged, and for the first time in her professional life, she didn't care. "I am not playing the martyr," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous trembling whisper. "A martyr chooses to suffer for a cause. I am just suffering, Arthur, because of you. So don't sit in my car, dripping mud onto my floor, and tell me about what suits me." Arthur stared at her. He didn't blink. The ambient light from the dashboard cast deep shadows under his cheekbones, making him look skeletal. "You were consistently late," he said, the words defensive, automatic. He was clinging to his rule book because it was the only thing he had left. "You breached the terms of your contract. I made a standard operational decision. It wasn't personal." "Of course it wasn't personal to you," Sarah snapped, leaning over the center console, invading his space. She smelled coffee on his breath, stale and expensive. "Nothing is personal to you. You live in a spreadsheet. But it was personal to me. My son's asthma is personal. My rent is personal." She pointed a rigid finger at the glowing gig app mounted on her air vent. The green digits glared in the dark. $84.20. "Look at that," she commanded. "Look at it." Arthur's eyes flicked to the screen. "I drove for 10 hours in a freezing storm," she said, her voice cracking, the raw emotion finally bleeding through the anger. 10 hours, bringing drunk college kids lukewarm tacos, praying my transmission wouldn't drop, terrified that I was going to slide into a ditch and leave my kid an orphan. For $84. That is my reality. You broke my life this morning, and you didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye when you did it." Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked back at the glowing green numbers. He had an MBA from Wharton. He knew numbers. He calculated profit margins in the tens of millions. But the absolute bleakness of that $84.20 seemed to short-circuit his brain. He looked down at his own wet, expensive shoes. He looked at the peeling plastic on the door panel. He looked at the cardboard box in the back seat, carrying the cheap plastic succulent and the framed photos of her son. For a long time, the only sound was the heater wheezing and the sleet pelting the glass. "Drive," Arthur said quietly. It wasn't a command. It was a request. Sarah put the car back in gear and pulled onto the road. The rest of the drive was heavy, suffocating. The anger had burned off, leaving Sarah hollowed out and vibrating with a strange caffeine-laced exhaustion. She didn't feel victorious. Berating an old, freezing man on the side of the road didn't pay the daycare bill. It didn't fix tomorrow. 10 minutes later, the blinding, harsh, fluorescent lights of the Exxon station pierced the gloom. It was an oasis of ugly, artificial brightness in the middle of the dark highway. A massive, muddy semi-truck idled by the diesel pumps, its engine a low, rumbling bass. Sarah pulled up to the glass storefront of the adjoining diner. The neon open sign buzzed with a frantic, dying electrical hum. She put the car in park and left the engine running. "We're here," she said. She didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead at the rack of windshield washer fluid stacked by the door. Arthur unclipped his seatbelt. The fabric snapped back with a loud clack. He didn't make a move to open the door. He just sat there, looking at the water pooling on the floor mat. "My phone is dead," he said, his voice flat. Sarah sighed, a heavy, ragged sound. She unclipped her phone from the mount and held it out to him. Her screen was heavily cracked in the bottom left corner, the glass held together by a thin layer of cheap plastic protector. Arthur took it. His fingers brushed hers. His skin was freezing, dry, and rough. He dialed a number from memory. He brought the cracked phone to his ear, waiting. "Yes," Arthur said into the phone, slipping back into his executive cadence, though the shivering undercut the authority. "This is Arthur Cade, account number 844 Alpha. I need a flatbed on Route 114, approximately 2 miles east of the junction. Yes, black ice." He paused, listening to the dispatcher. "No, I am at the Exxon station on exit 42. How long?" "A beat." 50 minutes, fine." He ended the call. He handed the phone back to Sarah. 50 minutes, he repeated, mostly to himself. "The diner's warm," Sarah said, placing the phone back on the mount. "You can buy a coffee. Wait inside." Arthur nodded slowly. He reached for the door handle, then stopped. He looked at the wet $500 still sitting on the center console. "I meant what I said," Arthur said. "Take it. It's for the ride." "I don't want your charity," Sarah said stubbornly, though her eyes lingered on the green bills. She hated her own pride. It was a stupid, expensive luxury she couldn't afford. "It's not charity," Arthur said, his voice hardening slightly, finding its familiar footing. "It's compensation for services rendered. You provided transportation in a crisis scenario, market rate for hazard conditions." He wasn't mocking her. He was speaking the only language he knew how to speak, a transaction. He was trying to give her a way to take the money without surrendering her dignity. Sarah reached out and picked up the bills. They felt gross, damp, cold, and smelling slightly of wet leather. She folded them and shoved them into her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Arthur opened the door. The freezing wind immediately howled into the car, biting at Sarah's exposed neck. He stepped out into the slush, slamming the door shut behind him. Through the rain-streaked window, Sarah watched Arthur Cade walk toward the diner. He looked pathetic. His expensive suit hung off him like a wet garbage bag. The wind whipped his hair round. He walked with a stiff, shuffling gait, his joints clearly locked up from the cold. He pulled open the heavy glass door of the diner and disappeared inside. Sarah put the car in reverse. She should leave. She had $500 in her pocket. It was enough to cover the immediate deficit. She could go home, sleep for 4 hours, and start looking for a new job on Friday. She had done her good deed. She had yelled at her boss, rescued him, and taken his money. It was a clean break. She looked at her rear-view mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale, exhausted, and deeply unsatisfied. She turned the engine off. The silence in the car was immediate and heavy. She pulled the keys from the ignition, zipped up her cheap winter coat, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The diner smelled exactly like a truck stop at 1 a.m. Burnt coffee, old fry oil, and industrial pine cleaner. The lighting was harsh, bouncing off the faux chrome trim of the counter. The only other customer was a trucker asleep in a booth, a half-eaten plate of eggs congealing in front of him. Arthur was sitting at the far end of the counter, perched awkwardly on a red vinyl stool. The waitress, a bored woman in a pink uniform chewing aggressively on a piece of gum, slid a heavy white mug of steaming black coffee toward him. Sarah walked over. Her cheap flat squeaked loudly on the wet linoleum. Arthur looked up as she approached. Surprise flashed across his tired face, quickly masked by his usual guarded neutrality. "I thought you left," he said, wrapping both of his trembling hands around the hot mug. "I was going to," Sarah said. She sat on the stool next to him, leaving one empty seat between them as a buffer. She didn't order anything. The smell of the grease was making her nauseous. Arthur took a sip of the coffee. He winced as the scalding liquid hit his throat, but he kept drinking. He needed the heat. "So why didn't you?" he asked, staring at his reflection in the dark liquid. "Because," Sarah said, leaning her elbows on the sticky laminate of the counter, $500 buys me a week. After that, I'm back to driving for pennies. And I can't do that to my son." Arthur didn't say anything. He kept his eyes on his mug. "You fired me for being 14 minutes late," Sarah said, her voice low, devoid of the screaming anger from the car. It was just a cold, hard fact now. "Because you said I was a liability to your supply chain." "You were," Arthur replied quietly. In a logistics firm, a breakdown in consistency creates a cascading failure. If you are late, the reports are late. If the reports are late, the client meetings are delayed. It is a mathematics problem, nothing more. "But you have a flaw in your math," Sarah said. Arthur finally turned his head to look at her. The bags under his eyes were prominent in the harsh light. "Enlighten me." "You view your employees as variables in an algorithm," Sarah said, meeting his gaze. She wasn't trembling anymore. She felt entirely grounded. "If a machine breaks, you throw it out and buy a new one. But people aren't machines. We break, we adapt, and we keep going. You fired me because you thought my chaotic life made me weak. But who picked you up tonight?" Arthur was silent. "Your perfectly structured life failed you tonight," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "Your expensive tires blew out. Your premium cell service dropped. Your money couldn't hail a cab out there. When the algorithm failed, it was a messy, exhausted, desperate single mother who pulled you out of the mud." She tapped her index finger on the counter. "Click slide," mimicking his tungsten pen. "I am good at my job," she said. "I am faster than anyone else on the floor. I process the data better because I have to, because I don't have the luxury of taking my time. My chaos doesn't make me a liability. It makes me resilient. You made a bad business decision this morning, Arthur." Arthur stared at her. For the first time since she had walked into his glass office that morning, he actually saw her. He didn't see a smudge on his spreadsheet. He saw a woman who had just worked a 22-hour day, pulled a man out of a ditch, and was now negotiating with him under fluorescent lights at a truck stop. He took another slow sip of his coffee. He set the mug down. Remote work is a logistical nightmare for data security, he said. His voice was clinical, evaluating. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face blank. She didn't jump. She waited. However, Arthur continued, turning his body slightly toward her, losing an analyst who already knows our proprietary software requires a 3-week onboarding process for a replacement. That is expensive. It reduces floor efficiency by 11% during the transition. It does, Sarah agreed, matching his clinical tone. If, Arthur said, emphasizing the word, I were to rescind the termination, it would not be a favor. It would be a recalculation of assets. I don't want a favor, Sarah said. I want Tuesdays and Thursdays remote. So when the babysitter flakes, I don't have to choose between my kid's breathing treatment and your quarterly reports. I'll hit every metric. I'll exceed them. Arthur looked at the diner wall, calculating. He was a man who hated losing control. He hated being proven wrong. But more than anything, he hated inefficiency. And firing a competent analyst only to be forced to respect her grit 12 hours later was an inefficiency he had to correct. You are at your desk by 8:30 on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, Arthur said, looking back at her. The terms were being set. If you drop below a 95% accuracy rate on the remote days, you are gone, and there will be no severance. 98%, Sarah countered. I won't drop below 98. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of Arthur's mouth. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. HR will email you an addendum by noon tomorrow, he said. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a wet business card, and laid it on the counter. See you on Monday, Sarah. Sarah looked at the card. It was thick, textured paper, slightly warped from the rain. She didn't smile. She didn't feel a sudden rush of warmth toward him. He was still a cold, calculating machine of a man. They were not friends. He hadn't given her the job back out of the goodness of his heart. He had done it because she cornered him and proved her value in a language he understood. But as she looked at the card, the crushing weight that had been sitting on her chest all day finally lifted. The air in her lungs felt clean. She stood up, her wet shoes squeaking on the floor again. Your tow truck will be here in 40 minutes, Sarah said. She pulled the $500 out of her coat pocket and laid 3 of the wet $100 bills next to his coffee cup. Arthur frowned. I said the money was yours. I charge base rate plus mileage, Sarah said, buttoning her coat. $200 covers the hazard pay. I'm not a charity, Arthur. She turned and walked out of the diner before he could respond. The freezing rain hit her face as soon as she pushed through the glass door, but it didn't feel as cold anymore. She got back into her beat-up Civic, the engine roaring to life with a familiar rattling comfort. She put the car in drive and pulled out of the brightly lit station, merging back onto the dark highway. She had 20 miles to go until she reached home, until she could sneak into Leo's room and listen to the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing. The windshield wipers squeaked, the tires chewed the slush, and for the first time all day, Sarah felt completely awake. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with kindness, but with cold, undeniable grit. Sarah didn't win by begging. She won by proving she was unbreakable. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when all the odds were against you? We want to hear your stories of resilience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength and subscribe for more.